Hello, everyone. This is Lindsay Griffin with Coptic Solidarity. I'm the Advocacy Director and Director of Development, and I just wanted to welcome all of you to our event today. Coptic Solidarity has hosted an annual conference in Washington, D.C. every year since the organization was founded until last year with COVID-19. And we thought, just be kind of a one-year deal. And as we all know, what's happened with the global pandemic, that things have taken a lot longer than a lot of us expected. So what we wanted to bring to you today is something of a hybrid program. Because we aren't on the Hill and we can't have members of Congress just drop by like we used to, we've gathered some recorded messages from government officials and members of Congress, which we'll be sharing with you throughout the program. But we also really miss that element of live interaction and of hearing from people in person. So what we brought to you today is a bit of both. We're going to have 2 live panels as well as a pre-recorded portion. And I just want to let all of the audience know, if you have questions for our panelists, there is an option to type a question. I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of the questions, but we'll certainly do our best. And we'll be receiving those throughout the program. So with that, I just want to welcome all of you. Thanks so much for joining our program, Unmasking Egypt's Political Propaganda Towards Coptic Christians. And we'll be hearing a welcome from our president, Ms. Carolyn Doss.
Thank you to all our honored guests and audience for joining us today. Despite the many challenges we have all been facing, Coptic Solidarity has remained on track with our commitment to defending the rights of Copts in Egypt. This past year, we have had many successes, one of which was to organize this conference that focuses on exposing the Egyptian government's efforts to change the narrative on the situation of Copts in Egypt. One major effort and accomplishment of this past year was to publish the Fact versus Fiction report in direct response to a pamphlet issued under the Egyptian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and created by a powerful lobbying firm on behalf of the Egyptian government. In that pamphlet, the Egyptian government claims great progress in the treatment of the indigenous Copts of Egypt. Our focus was to dissect, review, and examine each of those claims and inaccuracies in order to provide a factual response to those claims. And so is the focus of this conference, unmasking the Egyptian government's propaganda in regards to Coptic Christians. In order for us to continue to educate and advocate on the real issues impacting Christians in Egypt, we need to be loud, honest, and clear about the facts, and not blindly led by the Egyptian government's well-planned and financed propaganda campaigns. We hope today's program will continue to shed light on the problems Christians face in Egypt and the government's propaganda campaign that attempts to dull that light. Thank you for joining us today and helping unmask the Egyptian government's Coptic Christians propaganda campaign.
Hello, I'm Congressman Brad Sherman from California's best named city, Sherman Oaks. I want to say hello to my friends at St. Mary and St. Donathius Church in Northridge, and to my good friends, Dr. Mafu Skaras. Thank you so much for inviting me to make remarks during this Coptic Solidarity's annual virtual conference. I look forward to the opportunity to be able to address you in person here in Washington, D.C. sometime soon. For 25 years, I've been a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and for 25 years, I've continuously called for the end of the persecution of Egypt's Coptic Christians. I am also a member of the Religious Minorities in the Middle East Caucus and the International Religious Freedom Caucus. Back in 2019, Coptic Solidarity honored me with its annual Leadership Award due to my many years of advocacy and my strong support for Coptic equality and religious freedom. Thank you again, Coptic Solidarity, for honoring me with that award. Unfortunately, the arbitrary detention of Coptic and human rights activists continues in Egypt. As recently as October of last year, I joined with my colleagues in sending letters to President Sisi urging the immediate release of human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, political activists, and other prisoners of conscience in Egypt. These individuals should never have been imprisoned in the first place. In September of 2020, the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee, on which I have served for many years, held a long overdue hearing on the human rights situation in Egypt. During that hearing, I raised the case of a Coptic activist, Rami Kamel, an advocate for full rights for Egypt's Coptic Christian community. We must not allow the Egyptian government to punish or try to silence Coptic advocates, and when they do so, they must be held to account. I have been a co-sponsor of the bill supporting Coptic Christians in Egypt, resolutions we introduced in 2017, 2019, and now again in 2021. The resolution calls upon the Egyptian government to end the cultural of impunity for those who attack Coptic Christians, to release prisoners of conscience, and to enact legitimate reforms in the public sector, athletics, and society to ensure that Coptic Christians are given the same rights and opportunities as all Egyptians. The bill acknowledges the importance of the U.S.-Egypt partnership and Egypt's role in fighting terrorism and violent extremism. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on which I've served for 25 years, to get that important resolution passed. In recent years, I've met with President Sisi, with the Egyptian Foreign Minister Shukri, and various Egyptian ambassadors. In all those meetings, I make the message clear. I support the protection of the Egypt's Coptic community. Congress is paying attention and will not let the Coptic community be forgotten. And we oppose, of course, the violence that we unfortunately see against Egypt's Coptic community. Violence against Copts has long been a problem in Egypt, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Egyptian Christians. Religious violence against Copts has increased, unfortunately, in recent years. Of course, since the Arab Spring began in 2011, the community has been even more vulnerable. What we have seen is attack after attack with no accountability. Just to name one of the many examples, you'll all remember in December of 2016, during a mass murder at St. Peter's Church, a suicide bombing that resulted in the deaths of at least 25 and injury of at least 65 church parishioners. This attack was claimed responsibility by ISIS. Following this attack, I joined with Congressman Lott of Michigan and others in writing a bipartisan letter to the Egyptian ambassador urging increased security force protection for Copts in particularly Coptic churches. In August of 2013, Islamist-led mobs burned and destroyed various Christian religious properties, including churches, properties owned by Christians in Egypt, following the removal of the government led by the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why I was the chief Democratic co-sponsor of House Resolution 5974, the Coptic Churches Accountability Act. That bill would have required the State Department to report to Congress on the progress made in Egypt to restore those churches and other Coptic property damaged in August 2013 when those extremist mobs did their violence. The mobs that ransacked churches across the country, and that must never happen again. The Egyptian government needs to increase security for its own Coptic citizens. I look forward to working with you to do everything a Congress can do to support the Coptic community. Thank you. I'm Congressman Brad Sherman.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arnold Viersen. I'm the Member of Parliament for Peace River Westlock up in northern Alberta. Protecting faith is crucial to ensuring our fundamental freedoms are not just written in a constitution, but guaranteed to all citizens. Religious minorities across the world continue to face oppression and marginalization in 2021, undergoing maltreatment that serves as a clear violation of the fundamental human rights. The Coptic Christian community in Egypt continues to face injustice and persecution in practicing their faith. Mass street shootings and the burning of their churches are just a few examples of this community being under attack simply for their religion. Government authorities are failing to step in to prevent such attacks and will not allow freedom of religious practice. Historically, persecution has been seen as a crime against humanity, and that when failed to be acted upon can escalate into horrific levels of oppression. Every conference advocating for human rights in one part of the world or another encourages and motivates the fight for justice around the world. Your annual conference is a crucial step towards finding justice for the Coptic Christian community in Egypt and ensuring all members receive equality that they deserve. It's a vibrant way to push the Egyptian government to intervene and to put a stop to the religious discrimination. I stand with the Coptic Christian community in achieving religious freedom in Egypt.
Hi there, I'm Garnett, Genuis, Member of Parliament from Canada, and it's a pleasure for me to be here virtually to address this important conference. I had the pleasure of joining you in person in Washington a couple years ago and have very fond memories of what was discussed and as well as of the people that I was able to meet at that time. And I hope to have the opportunity for those kinds of in-person interactions at some point in the near future. I want to just thank and recognize Coptic Solidarity for the important advocacy work they do for the Coptic community, speaking about fundamental human rights issues and raising the voice of this very persecuted Christian community. It's been a pleasure for me to work directly with Lindsay and the team at Coptic Solidarity, in particular in the last 6 months on the Rami Kamal case. And I look forward to continuing partnership around this particular case as well as other important issues. I believe that it is the obligation of my government of Canada, as well as other governments around the world, to be a strong and principled voice for human rights. And for me, a principled foreign policy means being very clear about the fact that anytime people are seeking respect for their fundamental rights, their fundamental freedoms, they should know that Canada is on their side. They should know that the United States is on their side. They should know that Western democracies will side with people seeking justice, seeking protection of their religious and other liberties, seeking the opportunity to have their voice heard in their government. There was always this temptation of realpolitik to think that we can somehow sell out the rights of people in other countries in exchange for some kind of benefit in terms of relationship with their oppressors, whether that's a benefit in terms of cooperation on security issues, opposition to other powers that we see as presenting a geopolitical threat, or just preserving some kind of domestic stability. But in every case, these policies of selling out human rights have failed. They have failed to protect our security. They have failed to strengthen our geopolitical position, and they have led to worse disasters in the long run, including, of course, from the perspective of human rights. Because many autocrats wish to set themselves up as the only alternative to chaos or to other alternatives that are more injurious to our security. But in the process, they repress the voice of their people. They end up strengthening more extreme versions of opposition and destroying the effective and independent voice of more moderate forms of civil society. And that's why I believe in Egypt and in other countries around the world, we need to be clear about the importance of expanding human rights. And we need to hold governments accountable for the results they're able to achieve. There is so much more that needs to be done in Egypt to protect the fundamental human rights of the Coptic community, as well as to expand the sphere for freedom of speech and for democracy. Our voice on the world stage should be prioritizing the advance of religious freedom and all freedom, and the voice of people in their government, as well as independent civil society. These things are all connected. The idea that in the long run, autocratic rulers will be better for religious freedom, it might seem appealing in the short term, but it is not a path that I believe works in the long run. And we need to be continually pushing for that expansion of the full spectrum of freedom, including, of course, the security and freedom for religious minority communities. And then we also see too often in the West a downplaying of the persecution of Christians, a sense that it's somehow politically incorrect to focus on the human rights of Christians. But we should be committed to defending the rights, the freedoms, the dignity of all people, and recognizing the extreme extent to which Christians around the world face persecution. I commit to you my continuing voice on these important issues. And I want to again thank Coptic Solidarity for all the important work they're doing in this respect.
When I was just a young boy, I always had a dream to grow up and become a player for my favorite soccer team. My parents were barely making do. They could not afford to pay for membership in a fancy club, nor a coach to teach me to play. So after school, I would finish my work, then rush to meet my friends. We'd play street soccer in an endless match, until daylight draws to an end. Each of us would show off our new skills, and some of the new moves we learned, copying Ronaldo and Salah, pretending to be the players we loved. At night, I'd go home, lie in my bed, my thoughts drifting afar, and dream about the day I'll be a famous soccer star. My dad could clearly see my passion. In my talents, he had no doubts. One day, he said, "Get ready, Peter. Tomorrow, we'll go to tryouts." I cleaned my only pair of shoes and later went to bed with 1,000 dreams and wishful thoughts, all chattering in my head. We rose up early the next day to make it there on time. Battling our way through Cairo's traffic, we arrived to a very long line. It took many hours till I was called in, and there I was asked to try. I kicked the ball with all my might as my emotions ran so high. While I maneuvered my way to the net, my pulse raced in anticipation, but excitement overtook my fears when the coach expressed his admiration. "What a talented lad you are," he said as he took a bite from his snack. "With diligent training, I promise you, you will become a great center back. Today you made me very impressed. You did a wonderful job. Head to the office, fill out a form. We want you to join our club." I filled the form, walked back to the coach, and handed it over with glee. He stared at it for too long of a time, and in shock, looked back at me. "Your name is Peter? You are a Christian?" He made a violent roar. "Get out of here, you don't fit in, and don't you come back no more." I don't remember how I felt, how my trembling legs carried me out. I did not know just what I had done to deserve such a cruel cast out. In an age where humanity tries to mend the past and all nations join the reconciliation race, there is still a place over there in Egypt where Christians are given no place.
Hi, everyone. If you just joined us a little bit late, once again, I'm Lindsay Griffin with Coptic Solidarity. And as I mentioned in introduction, this event is a little bit of a hybrid between some live events as well as pre-recorded. At this point in time, we're going to move into our first live panel discussion. I'm going to be introducing our speakers all at once, so I don't have to keep interrupting in between the speakers. If you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to type them into the Zoom, into the question panel section, and we will get to as many questions at the end of the panel as possible. So with that, let me introduce our three panelists. The panel discussion is titled Recommendations for U.S. Policy Towards Egypt. One of the things that Coptic Solidarity tries to do is bring a variety of perspectives and also from different political perspectives. And so whether you agree with our panelists, whether you have different views, we encourage you to listen to the different perspectives. We encourage you to think of questions. And most of all, we try to take the recommendations from everyone that we invite to speak and to work on those with other organizations to move them forward. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. Our first panelist is Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, who at the time is the Vice President of MEMRI. This is the Middle East Media Research Institute. He was previously the vice president, between May 2015 to July 2017. But in between there, he had a very interesting role as the president of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, in which he had an opportunity to make a lot of different changes. Prior to that, he has a very long career in service to our country. There's many things I could say, but I'll just say a few shortly. He was a Foreign Service officer since 1983. Some of his most recent posts include the head of the State Department's coordinator for the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications from 2012 to 2015. He also at one point was the ambassador to the Republic of Equatorial Guinea from 2009 to 2012, and the charge d'affaires to the Republic of Sudan from 2007 to 2009, and a whole lot of wonderful other posts before that. Our second speaker is Dr. Leslie Pickelmall, and you can correct me on the pronunciation of your name. I'm sorry about that. She is the senior EU advocacy representative for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. We've had a lot of partnership with them in the past, but never with Leslie, who's representing the European side. So we're especially excited to hear your perspective. Dr. Pickelmall is the senior advisor, as I said, EU advocacy representative for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. She's been based in Brussels since 2015. She leads their advocacy on Egypt, Libya, and Algeria with European institutions, as well as with European member state representatives in Brussels and in capitals. She is a French American and was previously based in Cairo for 10 years, where she lived while earning a PhD from the Paris Institute for Political Studies, and worked as an academic in research and teaching. And most recently, we had the opportunity to work on an interparliamentarian letter with quite a few members of parliament on behalf of imprisoned Coptic activist Rami Kamal. And Leslie really carried the weight here, and she was the one who got the majority of the signatures from parliamentarians. So that was a fantastic introduction to working with you. And our final panelist is Mr. Stephen McInerney, who is Executive Director for the Project on Middle East Democracy. If you haven't seen the recent congressional testimony that he gave, I would just encourage everyone to watch that, because he spoke on some of the issues that we'll be touching on today. We'll include a link to that later for anyone who is interested. But Mr. McInerney started as the advocacy director in 2007 at PAMED and became the executive director in 2010. Before joining PAMED, he spent 6 years living, working, and studying in the Middle East and North Africa. He spent 2 years each in Egypt, Lebanon, and Qatar. He spent 2 years in a master's degree program in the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at the American University of Beirut, and 1 year on a fellowship at the Center for Arab Study Abroad and at the American University in Cairo, and 3 years teaching at Cairo American College and the American School of Doha. As you can see, we have very highly qualified panelists, and we are very much looking forward to what they have to share with us today, and particularly the recommendations they have for us. So with that, let's start with Ambassador Fernandez. I'm going to go off screen, but if you have questions, I'll be looking at those while our panelists are doing their presentations.
Thank you, Lindsay. Happy to be on with all of you. I understand each of us has about 15 minutes, so I'll try to move through that quickly, and I look forward to listening and learning from the other panelists. I was trying to think what I could say that maybe I haven't said before, others haven't said before, and so I hope my creativity is of some use and of some interest, because I tried not to say what often we read about. The nature of the Egyptian government. I mean, it is a military dictatorship intent on remaining in power, enriching itself while being in power. It's a regime where a space for criticism and free expression has decreased since the years of the Mubarak dictatorship. And I'm not saying this to any of this to criticize the regime. In fact, my main focus is going to be more about what the United States should do rather than on the Egyptian regime. But the basic nature of the regime obviously colors and informs its position vis-a-vis the Coptic Christian issue. Whatever is in the hearts of Egyptian government, senior Egyptian government officials, they know that this is an issue of interest to foreign partners, to the United States and to the West. And it's also of interest to key groups inside Egypt. First and foremost, it's an issue that is of interest negatively to the great adversary of the regime, to the Muslim Brotherhood, which focuses often on the issue, and also to a kind of intolerant, large, inchoate Islamist/Salafi population inside Egypt, which also cares about this. Obviously, both the MB and Salafis care about it in a very negative way. So along the spectrum of some of those who follow us are very interested in a positive way about this, and some of those who follow us are very interested in this in a negative way. The regime maneuvers along the spectrum. And so you see the kind of public affairs initiatives and rollouts it does to try to, address the one or the other side of the spectrum. So you see this perfect example of what, some have called, churches without worshipers and worshipers without churches, where you have this lavish construction of massive Christian religious buildings in some places, whereas at the same time you have dozens, indeed over 100 communities in Upper Egypt where you actually have Coptic populations that are not allowed to have churches at all. So this is kind of appealing to the one demographic at the same time while appealing to the other. Obviously, public order, the avoidance of fitna, the avoidance of turmoil, is the imperative that the regime values the most, aside from staying in power and making money. And it's also one that extremists use against Christians, knowing the nature of the regime and knowing that the regime will not respond. And of course, very much tied with all this process is this, as Lindsay and others have mentioned, is the kind of national unity, progress narrative, which is promoted by the state in a very aggressive manner, sometimes done with a kind of glove, velvet glove, as was done in the Egyptian embassy pamphlet, and sometimes within Egypt done much more harshly, much more aggressively, kind of enforcing a kind of an image, not just to foreigners, but to Egyptians themselves, a false image of national unity and of kind of progress, while at the same time discrimination continues not only in worship and in religious fields, but also in areas such as employment and justice and things like that. So, what should the United States be doing? What should be what are our policy recommendations? I think that the United States needs to engage with Egypt, of course. Egypt is an important country. But I think we need to adopt a much more cold-blooded, even cynical, transactional approach in our dealings with the Egyptian government that focuses more narrowly on core issues and especially on desired outcomes, while avoiding this trap which exists in foreign policy in general, but it's very evident in Egypt. And that is the risk or the danger of prioritizing process over results and engagement over real change. This is a problem, by the way, not just for the regime, but also for Western diplomats, I should say more for Western diplomats, is that we love processes. And if you're assigned to the U.S. Embassy or European Embassy in Egypt, or if you work in Washington or in Brussels on Egypt, you have a window of a few years, 2-3 years, and to make the most of a process of an issue. And management of a process is the easiest way to show results. These are results which actually are not real, but basically that there's a kind of movement means forward motion. And so when I say that we need to narrow our focus, I don't mean, as some have said, we shouldn't care about human rights and we should kind of have a kind of cold-blooded, kind of focusing on national security. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is we talk to the Egyptian regime about too many things. Obviously, human rights has to be one of the most important issues. But there's too much background noise that occurs. Our laundry list is so long that I think the regime realizes that if the Americans come in with a list of 12 things that they care about, and Coptic churches not being built or whatever is number 11 or number 12, they get the message. They know who matters, who has the weight in the relationship, whether it be in the national security relationships, so it means military, CIA, etc., and those partners which you have to deal with in the kind of political human rights reporting section. So the regime sees us, I think, as kind of a problem, the West, as a problem that needs to be managed. They don't trust us, they don't trust our intentions, and there's a long history about why they might not. But so my recommendation is we need to be more realistic about the nature of the regime and what we can achieve in a very tangible way from them. As I said, if you have a dozen asks and religious freedom is the last one, the Egyptians are going to understand what our real priorities are. And I think we also need to realize that the date when the US and the West could portray itself as the only game in town or the single alternative in what was back into the early 1970s, kind of the Soviet Union as ally of Sadat's Egypt, and they switched sides and all of that. The world that we live in has changed. For ill, for good. I think for ill, I think American power is somewhat diminished in that sense. But I would say, we need to talk less and do more. In other words, so much of as I said, there's this temptation of seeing engagement and seeing processes as success or as results or as wins in the battle for religious freedom or the battle for the rights of minorities. In the same way, all too often, language, verbiage is seen as a substitute for real change on the ground. I would rather have us, to be frank, sometimes say less and do more behind the scenes and maybe try to gain real, tangible wins on these issues rather than kind of having the satisfaction, well, we issued a statement on this issue or whatever. I would rather see Rami Kamel free rather than hand-wringing about Rami Kamel. That's the way I see it. We do have to find ways to be transactional, to build ties with the regime, to help it, but at the same time to try to get these tangible outcomes rather than a commitment to a process, especially a process and especially a situation which has a long fuse, something which is very long and involved. In my experience in the third world and in the dictatorships that I've served, almost in 30 years, almost every country I served in was a dictatorship. These regimes focused on control, focused on staying in power. The more complicated a Western process comes in, like Transparency International or whatever, the more difficult it is for these regimes, even if there's a goodwill to fulfill it, which there often isn't, the more difficult it is for them to actually do this. When it comes to Egypt, I would like to see, and when it comes to Egypt in this issue, I would like to see a focus on kind of simple, not so simple, but more clear asks that can be accomplished or that we could get. For example, a unified law of places of worship that does not discriminate against Christians, that is a tangible thing that can be done. Rather than these kind of vague promises about building stuff, which then gets tied up into the minutia of local places and permissions and all of that stuff. Also behind the scenes, again, I don't think this is an issue for public discourse. Publicly, it's easy to do it. It doesn't accomplish anything. Is to have asks related to the Egyptian government on this whole issue of a crisis of women and girls being kidnapped or being trafficked in Egypt, and a kind of lack of recourse for families to try to do something about that. And thirdly and finally, I think we need to kind of realize that when we deal with these things, or something which is very key to the dilemma of Christians, which is the whole issue of kind of sectarian mediation processes like al-Bayt al-A'ili, kind of family house mediation between basically Islamists and between the aggressors and their victims, is to realize, just like in the propaganda business in Egypt, that the sectarian dispute process, again, the word process, like the media process, like the propaganda process in Egypt, both inside and outside of Egypt, are part of the national security state, and they're part of the intelligence apparatus. And so when we deal with the Egyptians, and when we deal with the Egyptians on these hard-nosed, cold-blooded, transactional issues of national security and espionage and realpolitik and stuff like that, to realize that these are the same guys that are putting out, by the way, anti-American propaganda or anti-Semitic, allowing anti-Semitic material in the media, and also kind of putting out a false narrative of everything is fine in Egypt and things are great. And so, again, it seems to me that this is a process that needs to exist as well. Okay, there's a human rights constituency, there's a human rights apparatus, but it's actually an issue of national security. It's an issue of relationships between the intelligence communities, Western intelligence communities, and Egyptian intelligence communities. And that is where some of this needs to occur. That is, I think, my time. So my time is up. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing to the other two panelists.
Good afternoon or good evening for if anyone else is listening from Europe. I'll be speaking to you this afternoon, sorry, about the European side of the discussion here. In particular, the fact that there's been a palpable increase since earlier this year, March in particular, in the Egyptian government's lobbying efforts in European capitals and at the UN in Geneva. So both from Egyptian diplomats and from Gongos, ostensibly in an effort to counter the increasing attention to Egypt's alarming human rights record. This is most likely related to a number of factors, in particular the joint statement from over 30 states at the UN Human Rights Council March session this year criticizing Egypt's rights record, including the US among those over 30 states. And also the anticipation, of course, of a stronger stance on human rights from the Biden administration. It's connected to much civil society campaigning on rights issues and individual cases in Egypt and other factors. I'd like to highlight 5 narratives of note amongst the talking points, quote unquote, or the lobbying efforts from the Egyptian government in European capitals in particular, and to show how each of these narratives should be contrasted to real human rights issues inside of Egypt. The first narrative, as you will have guessed, is the same one you probably hear in the US, which is, the Egyptian government under Sisi is protecting the Christian community inside Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists and championing equal rights for Egyptian Christians. Subtext being, we're doing a great job, so don't criticize us, our rights record more generally. The many expert panelists speaking today will be able to tell you more than I on the reality that contradicts that claim. But of course, to summarize, while we know that little tangible progress has been made toward upholding equal rights for Christians inside Egypt and adequately addressing not only terrorist violence against them, but also the more common, more numerous sectarian violence incidents. And regarding the responsibility for this state of affairs, well, of course, no doubt, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood do not have an ideology and discourse that defends equality for Christians, but they did not stay in power long enough to really implement this political agenda involving this type of discrimination. And today, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood does not seem to be that much of a political force in Egypt anymore, in the sense that they may have supporters, but they are very much discredited amongst the majority of the general public. So they don't have power right now to either directly harm the Coptic community as a whole from a position of power at the center of the state, which they don't have. And they also don't have any other power to influence government policies and practices in that respect. So frankly, the government claimed to be protecting Christians from the Muslim Brotherhood today seems rather outdated. And of course, as for sectarian violence incidents, these do exist and they're very serious, but they seem to be perpetrated by citizens at large, as they have been, unfortunately, for a very long time. And basically, bottom line, it's the Egyptian government's responsibility to address discrimination and violence against all minorities in Egypt, including Christians, but we're not seeing results on this count. The second narrative that's often used in European capitals these days is that the Egyptian government under Sisi promotes women's rights and protects them from the proponents of political Islam in Egypt. So as I've just mentioned, well, the proponents of political Islam in Egypt are not making government policy. At the moment, they are not the main factor or the main protagonist in either the violation or the upholding of women's rights. It's up to the government, really, and the parliament, though the parliament is very much under executive control, to uphold women's rights. So how are they doing on that front? Sadly, there has also been little tangible progress in women's rights since the adoption of the law criminalizing sexual harassment in 2014. There's been, sadly, a failure to adequately protect, support, and defend women survivors of sexual violence, including when they come forward to seek justice. Most notably in the Fairmont gang rape case of 2014, which surfaced last year in 2020. And more generally, of course, lack of protection for witnesses and whistleblowers in sexual violence cases does lead many women not to report or testify for legitimate fear of retaliation. Early this year, in winter 2021, the Egyptian cabinet proposed amendments to Egypt's personal status law that contained alarmingly discriminatory and regressive language towards Egyptian women, and that threatened to roll back the gains achieved by the women's rights movement in Egypt in recent decades. There's also been, of course, a severe crackdown on women human rights defenders, women like Muzna Hassan, Azza Sulaiman, and rights lawyers or journalists who have been behind bars in arbitrary detention for years, like Mahinor al-Masri, Isra Abdel Fattah, and others. There's also been a crackdown on independent women's rights NGOs who were subject to judicial harassment and pressure and forced to scale down activities. Finally, in 2020 and 2021, there's been the new phenomenon of crackdown on women's social media influencers in blatant violations of the right to freedom of expression. At least 6 women have been sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2 to 6 years on charges of indecency, violating family principles and values, and so on. Among them, those who were prosecuted, one was a victim of rape who went online calling on the authorities to prosecute the perpetrators and subsequently ended up detained along with her alleged abusers. The third narrative I should highlight is the idea that Egypt hosts millions of refugees and affords them all of the same rights and services as Egyptian citizens. Egypt is a reliable partner of Europe to prevent illegal migration. So this idea has been prominently highlighted in Europe by Egyptian diplomats in both public and private exchanges, at least since 2015. And the numbers quoted by Egyptian diplomats or parliamentarians vary from 2 to 3 to sometimes even 5 million migrants or refugees, terms not frequently distinguished or used very accurately in the discourse. In fact, the total number of migrants and refugees in total, altogether, in Egypt as of mid-2020, according to UN and International Organization for Migration figures, was just under 550,000. Among that total, a subset of about 325,000 were refugees and asylum seekers. So yes, this has gradually increased in recent years, but it doesn't range in the several millions. The official figures I quoted may be underestimated to some extent, but not to the extent claimed by the authorities. And it's doubtful this figure would reach even 1 million, which would be 1% of the Egyptian population. Egypt has no asylum law, and so the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is responsible for refugee status determination in Egypt. It is unfortunately severely underfunded and has low capacity, and therefore it's very slow in Egypt. It also has very little autonomy from the authorities on the ground. In theory, many parts of Egyptian legislation should give refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants access to state-provided basic services in Egypt. But in practice, they're often not able to access them. And meanwhile, the crackdown on civil society has also affected its ability to fill the gap and to meet people's needs. Refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants are also victim of the climates of increasing racism and xenophobia, in particular against people from sub-Saharan African countries, but also Syrians. Violence and discriminatory attacks are on the rise. On the 29th of October last year, a 12-year-old Sudanese child, Mohammed Hassan, was brutally killed by an Egyptian man. The killing sparked protests among members of the Sudanese community around him, both where the child had lived and in front of the UNHCR office. Protesters also voiced anger about violence and discrimination they endure in Egypt and about the state's failure to protect them. And nonetheless, dozens of them were in fact arrested. In general, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants are often unable to access justice when they're victims of violence, amongst other factors, for fear of being detained and possibly deported themselves. Many people in Egypt are in fact detained for irregularly crossing or attempting to cross borders in or out of Egypt. There are no dedicated facilities for immigration-related detention, so people are detained in this way or held in prisons or in other premises belonging to the security bodies for very long periods. They are held in extremely overcrowded and abysmal conditions, including during the pandemic. The UNHCR has irregular and inadequate access to these locations. People can face trial for entering or exiting Egypt irregularly, including by military courts, without access to the asylum procedure pretty often, without access to the legal counsel pretty often, without means to appeal the lawfulness of their detention, to due process, to a court interpreter. It just goes on. The outcomes, of course, of these trials are very unpredictable. Even without being referred to trial, people often end up facing the choice between remaining behind bars and being deported to their countries of origin. People have been deported back to countries of war, such as Syria, Yemen, or to a high risk of persecution, including in Eritrea or in pre-revolution Sudan. The fourth narrative I'd like to highlight is that Egypt is leading a sincere and effective struggle against terrorism in Egypt and across the MENA region, for which lots of European-made weapons are needed and which would be undermined by any criticism of Egypt's rights record. Well, the military's fight against ISIS has gone on for many years, although the group's numbers had reportedly been pretty small in Sinai. Analysts have put forward different reasons for this, which I won't go into. But it seems like one interpretation is probably correct, is that it seems that there has been more of a strategy of containment than eradication of ISIS as a fighting force in the Sinai. In any case, it's not advisable to dissociate the counterterrorism performance of Egypt from its human rights record, nor is it advisable to treat the two as a zero-sum game. Massive, large-scale violations, serious violations against civilians in Sinai, and failure to protect them from ISIS have long hindered the military's ability to get these civilians on board with the fight against ISIS, and more generally to stabilize the situation. Whereas across Egypt, large-scale abuse of detainees, extrajudicial executions, other violations with almost zero access to justice and redress for those involved creates grievances among detainees and prisoners, which can actually fuel radical recruitment in Egyptian prisons. Violations like torture and enforced disappearance, unfair trials also create grievances more broadly among the population, which has no remaining channels available to legally, peacefully, and safely express these grievances and mobilize for reform. So it is conducive to radicalization and unrest. Finally, I'd like to flag the opinion of UN human rights experts 5 months ago, who warned in a public statement that, I quote, "We are deeply disturbed about counterterrorism law, its definitions, misuse, and the practice by Egyptian authorities, in particular the misuse of listing procedures at national levels to attack individuals engaged in human rights work. The continued misuse of counterterrorism powers is not consistent with the state's international law obligations and undermines broader international efforts to prevent terrorism by misusing such powers domestically." The experts concluded the cases they were commenting on, that they were raising in the statement, and other cases indicate, I quote, "a systemic problem with human rights protections in Egypt, as well as a systemic problem in the abuse and misuse of counterterrorism law and practices." Sorry, I can see I'm running out of time here. So very quickly, the last narrative I should flag was simply the idea that Egypt provides an open environment for civil society, in particular with the new and improved NGO law. So for those of us who work in MENA-based human rights NGOs, this is almost a joke, but sadly it is actually an advocacy narrative for the Egyptian government. Simply to say, it should suffice to say that the NGO law and its implementing regulation or bylaw, finally published earlier this year, place severe restrictions on all aspects of NGOs' creation and existence and activities and collaboration with any foreign entity. The intransigence of the administration and security agencies in the last few years have really had a crippling effect on developmental and charitable associations. Many NGOs have been forced to suspend activities or to roll back activities due to many restrictions. Human rights organizations are facing the most brutal crackdown since the mid-'80s, battered by an arsenal of legislation, but also judicial harassment, arbitrary travel bans, asset seizures, and increasingly draconian reprisals for human rights work, including the prosecution and imprisonment of rights defenders. Egypt is ranked not free on the Civicus Monitor, the Freedom House country rankings, many other civil society rankings. So in sum, all of these narratives are characterized by the fact that they play on the ugliest aspects of European politics, be it xenophobic fear of migration, Islamophobia in Europe, and the wrong assumption that supposedly secular military regimes will be better for minorities and for women than Islamist governments, when in fact it's clear that both commit severe violations across the board. And a transactional mentality with a kind of implicit blackmail in which there's an attempt to use fake narratives in order to convince European leaders that they should not be speaking up about Egypt's human rights record. And among these narratives, the religious freedom narrative is clearly as divorced from reality as the rest of them. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to speak today. Thanks very much to Coptic Solidarity for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. I have the pleasure of following both Ambassador Fernandez and Leslie. I strongly agree, generally with everything that both of them said, and I look forward to adding a few of my own points. I'm not going to say too much about the situation in Egypt. Leslie had some, very strong, compelling remarks along those lines, and I understand that the next panel will include more detail on the Egyptian regime's really awful record, and with it's not improving on issues of religious freedom, especially for the Coptic Egyptians and other religious minorities. I'm going to focus my remarks primarily on U.S. policy, and I agree with several of Ambassador Fernandez's strong recommendations, and I'll kind of endorse some of those and add some of my own thoughts as well. I think my first recommendation to U.S. policymakers, both in the U.S. administration, the executive branch, and also in Congress, as well as even more broadly to all of us here in the Washington policy community, is just simply to be honest and frank, both about the situation in Egypt, as well as about U.S. policy and the failures of U.S. policy. If you look back 10 or 15 years or 5 years or almost any time period at what U.S. officials identified as the goals for U.S. policy, those goals have not been met, and in fact, we're moving further and further away from them. But I think there's a stubborn refusal by many U.S. policymakers to acknowledge the failures of U.S. policy in Egypt, to acknowledge that Egypt is becoming less stable, less secure, and much more brutally repressive authoritarian military dictatorship than it has been in the past, while U.S. policy has laid out kind of goals of the opposite of that. And so I think in order to see changes in U.S. policy, I think we first have to see a recognition here in Washington that the existing policies are not successful. I'm getting messages that no one can see me, but it seems people can hear me. I suppose I will just keep speaking, and hopefully that will be can be corrected. But I think we've really not seen an honest reflection in Washington of the failures of U.S. policy, and we've also not seen an sort of honest assessment in Washington by U.S. government officials in the executive branch or in the Congress about the situation in Egypt. And Leslie very sort of clearly and eloquently outlined several of the main points of the propaganda campaign by the Egyptian regime. And sadly, we see some of those same points reflected in the talking points of U.S. officials. And just as a recent example, I would point to 2 weeks ago, Secretary of State Tony Blinken was testifying at a congressional committee hearing and had an exchange with Congressman Hal Rogers that I found deeply disturbing. An exchange about Egypt in which Congressman Rogers praised Sisi and praised the regime and repeated Egyptian government talking points that are simply factually very far from the truth. And I was dismayed to see Secretary of State Blinken agree with him and endorse those talking points. And those talking points included praising the Egyptian regime for its progress on religious freedom, which there has not been any. And Leslie just outlined, some of the facts that are contrary to that. He also praising the Egyptian regime for its progress on issues of women's rights, women's empowerment, and gender-based violence, when in reality, the situation for these issues in Egypt is declining and clearly getting worse. And so I think it's very deeply troubling to see U.S. officials, senior members of Congress, chairs of important committees, and also U.S. officials, including as senior as the Secretary of State, basically lying on behalf of the Egyptian regime. And I think and basically participating in these very damaging propaganda campaigns. So that's my first recommendation, is that we have to stop. U.S. officials have to be honest about the situation in Egypt, about the reality, the nature of the military dictatorship that rules Egypt, and as well as the failures of U.S. policy. Secondly, I think the U.S. government needs to shift away dramatically from its longstanding approach of essentially providing unconditional support to Egypt's military and to its ruling regime. When successive administrations have tried to influence events on the ground in Egypt or influence the behavior of the Egyptian regime, the most common preferred approach has been to sort of cozy up, have a very close relationship with the Egyptian president, with the Egyptian military, and to politely, nicely ask them in private meetings to make some changes on human rights issues. And we've seen this approach fail over and over and over and over. And sadly, I think it appears that is the preferred approach of this new administration as well. And although it's only been in place for 6 months, we haven't seen any real progress as of yet. And I think that we shouldn't expect to see that. What we've learned from the past is that the way to influence the Egyptian regime's behavior is to be tough with it and to accompany expressions of concern on human rights issues, including religious freedom issues, by laying out clearly what the consequences will be for inaction on these issues, and sort of conversely, perhaps what rewards there might be for actions and for progress. The Egyptian regime only responds to tangible, use of leverage and pressure and/or incentives. It does not respond to just sort of politely, quietly raising issues while continuing to provide unconditional support. In terms of that unconditional support, the most obvious place to start in changing the dynamic of unconditional support for President Sisi and his military dictatorship is with the $1.3 billion in military aid provided to Sisi's regime annually, which is among the largest packages of foreign aid that the United States gives to any country in the world. I think that this $1.3 billion has not served U.S. interests. It's very outdated. I think it continues largely because of the result of a lot of these propaganda campaigns and lobbying efforts that have been mentioned already. And I think that it undermines, rhetoric about human rights, both globally and in Egypt specifically. I do think that this administration should have a real opportunity to change the sort of long-standing U.S. policy failures on Egypt, simply by trying to live up to the rhetoric of President Biden, both during the campaign last year, and as well as some of the rhetoric of President Biden since he's taken office, and some leading members of his administration in talking about, they've said repeatedly that human rights and support for democratic values will be central to their foreign policy. In Egypt, as of now, that has simply not been the case. We also saw specifically on Egypt last year, when President Biden was still campaigning, he said very clearly that if elected, there would be no more blank checks for President Sisi, who he referred to as, quote, Trump's favorite dictator. But unfortunately, what we've seen in his first 6 months in office is continued blank checks. We've seen this administration's first budget request has been for the has had no changes. It's been for the full 1.3 billion in foreign military financing for the Egyptian regime. It has requested that Congress remove conditions on 300 million of that military aid. And while this administration has, following several meetings with the Egyptian leadership, there have been sort of mentions of concern of human rights issues. There's been nothing tangible to back that up. And Ambassador Fernandez, mentioned earlier the importance of action rather than just talk. And I think that's exactly the problem that we're seeing currently from this administration. So I would strongly urge this administration to begin by reducing the military aid to Egypt. Congress has conditioned 300 million annually of the 1.3 billion on making significant progress on human rights, on a wide variety of human rights issues in Egypt, including religious freedom issues. Clearly, that progress has not been made, and I think it's very important. This administration, within the next couple of months, will have to make a decision as to whether to exercise a waiver, claiming that it's in the U.S. national security interest to waive those conditions. I believe very strongly that it is not at all in the U.S. national security interest to waive those conditions. On the contrary, it is in the U.S. national security interest to see respect for the rights of Egypt's citizens, to see progress in terms of basic human rights, including religious freedom for Copts and other religious minorities. We're not seeing this at all. And I think the most likely way to see this would be to demonstrate to the Egyptian regime that this administration does take these issues seriously and is willing to back up that serious concern and some of the rhetoric that we've seen with tangible action, starting by enforcing the congressional conditions on military aid. The last point I want to make is that I've been talking quite a good bit about the administration. I think there's also a very important role for Congress to play. Moving forward, I'd like to see Congress remove this national security waiver from Egypt's military aid, and also see Congress in generally try to play a much stronger role in requiring the U.S. administration to adhere to numerous provisions of U.S. law that should prohibit the United States from providing billions of dollars of weapons to what is honestly one of the world's worst, most repressive dictators, who should be viewed as a mass murderer. And there are, as I said, there are at least four or five different provisions of U.S. law that should prohibit this, that unfortunately successive administrations have chosen not to abide by, and Congress has failed to enforce. And then the final point that I want to make, I want to commend the president of Coptic Solidarity in her opening remarks for this event, and she, speaking very clearly about the sort of the very brazen propaganda campaign and lobbying effort by the Egyptian regime here in Washington. And Leslie spoke, about the same efforts underway in Europe. And I want to, encourage members of Congress to openly fight back against these propaganda campaigns and these lobbying efforts. And we've seen the Egyptian regime ramp up its efforts here in Washington by bringing on sort of high-powered, influential voices, including members of both political parties. We've seen Congressman Ed Royce, Republican, who formerly served as the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, after leaving Congress, sadly go to become a lobbyist for the Egyptian regime. On the other side of the aisle, we've seen Nadim El-Shami, who served as Speaker Pelosi's chief of staff for many years, leave her office to also become a lobbyist for the Egyptian regime. This type of action should be viewed as disgraceful. And I think we need to see many members of Congress that do recognize the dangers of these sort of lobbying and propaganda efforts on behalf of brutal dictatorships like that in Egypt, to fight back more strongly against them. I think there should be efforts made to restrict, lobbying and propaganda efforts on behalf of dictatorships. I think also members of various congressional committees can make a stronger effort to rebut the efforts of these lobbyists, as well as people who work for many other organizations in Washington that are funded by the Egyptian regime or other dictatorships. I think it's also important to see congressional committees make a real effort not to include witnesses, not invite people to testify who are being paid in any way by these dictatorships in the Middle East, including the Egyptian regime, which has a very distorting effect on the narratives regarding Egypt on Capitol Hill. So I'll leave my remarks there. I look forward to any questions.
Well, thank you so very much to all of our panelists for your excellent presentations. I think we have time for maybe one question for each panelist. So I'm going to put these in the order in which you all presented. So the first question is for Ambassador Fernandez. U.S. government officials have argued that while the overall human rights situation in Egypt has deteriorated, religious freedom, especially for Christians, has improved. Do you agree or disagree, and why? And just to kind of phrase that a little bit more, we've seen that as we met with government officials, the argument has been made quite a bit by State Department and a number of other U.S. government officials, and has been especially perpetuated by evangelicals within the United States. So coming from a different perspective, Ambassador Fernandez, what would be your response to that question?
Well, first of all, the regime made a concerted effort to reach out to evangelicals. So it's they actually did that. So they gave them the dog and pony show and, all that stuff. I mean, look, I would love to be able to say that the situation has improved for Christians in Egypt, and I would gratefully acknowledge that. The reality is that there's a huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground. There are, as I said in my remarks, there's some window dressing, right? Mm-hmm. Look at this massive cathedral in the administrative capital of Egypt. Look at this thing. Aren't we tolerant? And for that, and then there are 100 things on the granular level of bigotry, of discrimination, of violence. So it just doesn't add up. I mean, I understand the reason for the regime to, like I said, it plays this double game. It's riding this tiger that it's partially created and uses. So it uses intolerance. The regime doesn't combat intolerance; it manipulates it according to its interests. So, I mean, I would say those that look at that to kind of say that there's been an improvement, they need to look deeper, because things on the surface are not exactly the way they are.
Yeah. Thank you for that response. That's essentially, what we've seen as well, and there's been quite a lot of pushback, to that narrative from outside of the evangelical community. And I think it's really important that we speak clearly on what is happening and what is not happening. And the window dressing is not enough, such as the building of a new cathedral. So my second question is for Leslie. What role could the EU institutions, especially the Commission and Parliament, play in enhancing the human rights situation in Egypt?
Well, very good question. The European Parliament has really done almost everything it can. It's been the most concerned, the most mobilized, and the most active of all the European institutions. The Parliament adopted 4 urgency resolutions in 3 years on human rights issues in Egypt, the last one being in December 2020. Unfortunately, the Parliament has no decision-making powers regarding foreign policy. Its only real powers are regarding policy making inside the EU. The Parliament has consistently addressed the other institutions, not only the Egyptian authorities, and urged those other institutions and European member states to take a number of actions. So as they've made policy recommendations, they've reiterated them, they've stressed them. Unfortunately, there's not a lot more they can do. In the last resolution, they called in particular for the EU and member states to bring targeted individual sanctions against individual Egyptian perpetrators of grave human rights violations under the new EU global human rights sanctions regime, which is a regime that allows for asset freezes and visa bans. The Commission is essentially controls the purse strings. So the commission should definitely look at different policy options for conditionality on specific kinds of funding, financial support for Egypt through for everything that's not, urgent humanitarian assistance in case of emergency. And to some extent, the Commission does do that, not really conditionality, but in the funding per capita from the EU to Egypt is less than, say, to Tunisia, for example. However, a lot more could be done, particularly in terms of doing this more explicitly and with clearer public messaging on the intentionality of this policy. Also, the other institutions, so the Council, the External Action Service, and the European Council could all also really take a stronger, clearer, and more consistent public stance on principles-based public stance on rights issues in Egypt. And I think also really try to stick to the values and norms of the EU rather than realpolitik related calculations.
Yeah. Thank you. That's certainly helpful. And it sounds like there's definitely room for the US to partner more with the EU in these areas, and especially with the foreign funding. So my last question is for Stephen. And part of this also comes from watching you testify in a recent hearing regarding the human rights situation in Egypt. And you spoke quite extensively about the sort of cycle of American legislators who get on committees, and then they kind of go on trips to countries, they get wined and dined, they start asking for different things for these concessions, maybe whatever it is that they've been asked to get, and then by the time they retire, they turn around and get hired by lobbying firms from these countries, such as Ed Royce, and it is bipartisan. We see it on both sides. And it's certainly been an issue for us with, Coptic Solidarity. We've worked on all the resolutions on behalf of Coptic equality. And actually the first one that we worked on with French Hill that got introduced, Congressman Royce was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So a couple of years later, to see that now he's working for Egypt is kind of like, that's very interesting. So my question for you is, what more practically can NGOs and concerned individuals do to stop this cycle, or what can we do to draw more attention to it?
Sure, thanks. I do think this is a very important issue, and it's not only a problem with Congress; it's also, unfortunately, very, very much a problem with the executive branch as well. We see many career diplomats retire and then take jobs as lobbyists or with consulting firms paid by the Egyptian regime or other regimes in the region, or by defense manufacturers here in the United States that want to preserve the sort of corrupt provision of weapons to some of these dictatorships like Sisi's in Egypt. As far as what can be done by NGOs, I mean, the first step is through whatever opportunities we have to draw more attention. And then a second step is to really press Congress for action on these issues. And I would love to see Congress put a ban in place so that kind of both members of Congress and their staff, at least for some period of time, maybe for 10 years after leaving Capitol Hill, should not be allowed to lobby on behalf of dictatorships. I think that they're doing so is very, very detrimental to our political processes and to our foreign policy. And I think the same kind of restriction should be in place for the executive branch as well. If someone leaves the State Department or USAID or the White House, they should not be allowed, at least for a period such as 10 years, I would argue permanently, but at least for an extended period of time, we need to eliminate this kind of cycle of people going back and forth between what should be public service for the United States and lobbying on behalf of dictatorships like that of Sisi in Egypt. So I think that would be a very important step, and I think all of us can try to push push Congress for this. And I think particularly with the executive branch, it should go the other way as well. Not only after leaving service in the executive branch should you be prohibited from lobbying on behalf of dictatorships like that of Egypt, but also anyone who has worked and been paid by regimes such as the Egyptian regime, authoritarian dictatorships, should not be allowed to be political appointees, should not be allowed to serve in the government. And so I think these are among the most important steps that can be taken. And I mentioned earlier also that Congress should, in the meantime, also make a real effort not to allow any of these types of individuals to while they're being paid by these governments to testify in congressional hearings and influence the narratives in that way as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you. And certainly, Coptic Solidarities, we've seen this, just with Egypt, we know that it impacts many other countries that you all work on. And I think it's something that we would definitely be interested in collaborating on. And also mentioning the staff, I think it's also critical. Julian Peckett, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, started Foreign Lobby after being a journalist with Al Monitor and a lot of other groups. And one of the things that, we've seen is it's not only just the legislators, but often the staff members who also go and lobby. And so, using those relationships, it becomes very profitable for them, but harmful to the promotion of human rights. So with that, I just want to thank all of our panelists so much for your time. I know things are very busy, so thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of your recommendations. And we look forward to being in touch with you soon. And at this point, we're going to go back to our some of the pre-recorded portion of our program, and we're going to hear now from a number of members of Congress and other government officials who have recorded messages for this program.
It has always been an honor to speak at Coptic Solidarity's annual conferences, and I'm pleased to be with you again today, virtually. This subject of the treatment of Coptic Christian population in Egypt has been at the top of my foreign policy agenda since I first introduced a resolution supporting Egypt's Coptic Christians and calling on an end to the culture of impunity back in 2017. I believe now, more than 3 years later, this is still at the forefront and should be a priority for the incoming Biden administration on its relationship with Egypt, because the culture of impunity remains. And in recent years, we've seen the government get in on the act. I've reintroduced my resolution this Congress, H-Res 117, supporting Coptic Christians in Egypt, which has a diverse and bipartisan coalition of members that co-sponsor it. I'd also like to give special thanks to my friend and Democratic lead on H-Res 117, Foreign Affairs Committee member David Cicilline of Rhode Island, for his leadership and his support once again in this Congress. H-Res 117 acknowledges the importance of the United States-Egypt partnership in advancing our common interests. It recognizes Egypt's need for certain governmental reforms and calls on the Egyptian government to end that culture of impunity and make examples by arresting, prosecuting and convicting those responsible for attacks on Christians. It also calls on the government to hold these local government officials accountable who fail to enforce their own law. I look forward to working with my colleagues in the House and engaging with the Egyptian government to see that the condition of Egypt's Copts improves. Thank you again, Coptic Solidarity, for hosting this timely event and for inviting me to speak with you today.
Hi, my name is Derek Sloan, Member of Parliament for Hastings-Lennox and Addington, here in Ontario, Canada. Behind me are the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, and I send you my greetings. I would like to say that religious persecution against Christians exists all around the world and also in Egypt. I would like to express my support for full religious equality for Coptic Christians in Egypt, as well as support for Coptic Solidarity as an organization. Thank you for the work that you do, and God bless Coptic Christians in Egypt, Canada, the United States, and all around the world. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Don Beyer, and I am privileged to serve as a member of Congress from Virginia's 8th Congressional District, which is right outside Washington, D.C. And I just came to bring most welcoming remarks to our Coptic Solidarity Annual Conference. Thank you for gathering. Thank you for the work you're doing. I believe I'm here because I was inspired to co-lead the Egypt Human Rights Caucus with Representative Tom Malinowski after working with the family of Aya Hijazi, who is an Egyptian American who lived in my district in Falls Church, Virginia. And while Aja was working for children's rights in Egypt with her husband, literally taking street children off of the street and getting them food, clothing, housing, trying to take care of them, she was arrested by the government and held in pretrial detention for more than 3 years. And it took the work of both Presidents Barack Obama and President Donald Trump to finally get her freed. We had worked through different secretaries of state, the Egyptian ambassadors and the like. But sadly, Egyptian authorities used pretrial detention to intimidate and punish human rights defenders, political opponents, and journalists. So the hopes and promises of the demonstrations at Tahrir Square, they've not yet led to the reforms and the changes that they called for. So Representative Malinowski and I decided to announce the formation of the Egyptian Human Rights Caucus on the 10th anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution. Our hope is that through this caucus, through the press attention we get, both here and in Egypt, that we can bring attention to the human rights abuses in Egypt and hopefully bring about meaningful change. I've also been inspired by Mohammed Sultan, who's the founder of the Freedom Initiative and is a human rights advocate who has also suffered for his political activism in Egypt. He now lives in Northern Virginia and he continues to give voice for political prisoners in detention. Another individual arrested for exercising his right to freedom of expression is Rami Shah. He spent his life championing peaceful political activism and supporting Palestinian rights. And for this, he is also detained. We must do all that we can to stop the unlawful and extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, politically motivated reprisals, restrictions on the freedom of the press, on expression, on the internet, restrictive laws on civil society organizations, restrictions on political participation, violent targeting of the LGBTQI community, and forced child labor. Boy, that's a lot, just one long paragraph of all the things that we need to address. And religious freedom, especially, is also part of the human rights we want to protect. You know, I'm an American, and turns out most Americans came here seeking religious freedom, fleeing the religious repression of their home country at the time. Copts have been imprisoned under blasphemy laws for insulting Islam. This year, Nabil Habashi was kidnapped for ransom and later murdered simply for building a church. The 2020 Human Rights Report cites incidents of societal sectarian violence against Coptic Christians, and Egypt was placed on the special watch list by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for systematic and ongoing religious freedom violations. Coptic prisoners of conscience include Rami Kamel, George Patrick Zaki, and Peter Nashat Naim Rageb. Even those who stand up for their Coptic colleagues have been targeted, like Hisham Heikel, who stood up against discrimination and was dismissed from his job. Look, I believe that the Coptic community has the absolute right to live without fear, the right to live with religious freedom. And we see it in the United States. We have the Coptic community in the United States is strong and active. Over 500,000 Coptic Christians in the United States and around 250 churches. Hopefully, I want every one of those 500,000 to know and believe that they're living with complete freedom of religious expression here in the United States. And I hope that together we can bring attention to the rights abuses in Egypt, that we can protect basic freedoms, including religious freedom, and encourage a more democratic Egypt. I hope you have a good annual conference. I hope it leads to solid, constructive, concrete action steps that we can all take to move forward. And let's hope that history has a positive forward direction for the benefit of all of us. Thanks so much.
Special thanks to Coptic Solidarity for your extraordinary work on behalf of Egypt's Coptic Christians. Your persistence, determination, courage, and commitment to truth has not only informed, but motivated many to more effective action, including calling on Egypt to respect religious freedom, equal citizenship rights for Coptic Christians, and for the government to free human rights defender Rami Kamel. A decade ago, on July 22nd, 2011, I chaired the first ever congressional hearing on the credible and gut-wrenching fact that Egyptian Coptic women and girls were being subjected to abduction, forced conversions, and forced marriages to Muslims. Coptic women and girls are victims of human trafficking, and according to Coptic Solidarity's September 2020 report, Jihad of the Womb, Trafficking of Coptic Women and Girls in Egypt, quote, these heinous crimes have been conducted with near impunity. And as one former member of a kidnapping ring cited in the report, the abduction of such girls is now at an all-time high. Far too many in the international community, including the U.S. government, have dismissed or trivialized this cruelty as, quote, alleged allegations. Yet anti-human trafficking expert Michelle Clark told my commission in 2011 that after directly speaking to over 50 women and after meeting with their families and parish priests who regularly witness this occurrence, quote, I'm here to confirm these allegations. She said, I'm here to attest these claims should not be disputed. I'm here to say that categorical denials of kidnappings, rapes, forced marriages, and forced conversion are an affront to the dignity of Egyptian Coptic women. She goes on, I know this. Why? Because I have spoken to women who have been traumatized after alleged kidnappings, who will suffer a lifetime of infertility due to an alleged rape, who will move from home to home in constant fear of reprisal by alleged perpetrators, and who are denied their Christian identities because of an alleged conversion. For the record, I raised the trafficking of Coptic women and girls and forced marriages when President al-Sisi visited the capital in 2017. He denied that it has or was occurring. So clearly more has to be done to expose and end this violence against Coptic women and girls. I plan on chairing another hearing on these crimes against women and girls soon. And as prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, I believe an all-out effort must be made to protect the victims, prosecute the perpetrators, and prevent this hideous form of trafficking in the first place. Coptic Solidarity's Caroline Das testified at my 2011 hearing and strongly and persuasively defended Coptic Christians, especially those who have been abused, raped, and tortured. And she said, quote, that real change is possible, but I fear that change will not happen unless there is an exponential increase in pressure, both from inside and outside of Egypt. Exponential increase in pressure. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, and God bless you.
I'm Commissioner Jim Carr of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, an independent, bipartisan federal body. Thank you to Coptic Solidarity for this opportunity to speak in support of the Coptic community, and of course, for its ongoing efforts to advocate for the full and equal rights of all Copts in their Egyptian homeland. USCIRF continues to call on the government of Egypt to fulfill its stated purpose to bring religious freedom and true equal citizenship rights to all its people, both in law and in practice. And as we have for many years, we continue to recommend to the U.S. Congress, State Department, and the White House that they work through our many forms of longstanding bilateral ties with Egypt to consistently share in delivering this message. Today, I'd also like to highlight on behalf of USCIRF the ways in which the religious freedom of Copts, their advocates, and indeed all Egyptians often coincide and overlap. With this connection in mind, I reiterate today our call for the immediate and unconditional release of Rami Kamul, an important advocate for the rights of Copts, who has now been in prison and in solitary confinement, under an unjust system of pre-trial detention since November of 2019. The terrorism-related charges against Rami remain as dubious now as they were 19 long months ago, and he has suffered enough over them. It's time that he go home, just as it's time that others caught up in such detentions are also freed, such as Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights researcher Patrick George Zaki, who is now similarly languished in prison since February of 2020. But religious freedom should not extend only to the Coptic community or to those individuals and organizations who stand for their rights. It must extend to all Egyptians, regardless of what they believe or do not believe. While I recognize the Coptic Solidarity mandate focuses on advocacy on behalf of its own community, I must also emphasize that others share in the impact of Egypt's failure to match its improved discourse on religious freedom to the actual institutional practice of it. But religious freedom should not only extend only to the Coptic community or to those individuals and organizations who stand for their rights. It must extend to all Egyptians, regardless of what they believe or do not believe. While I recognize that Coptic Solidarity's mandate focuses on advocacy on behalf of its own community, I must also emphasize that others share in the impact of Egypt's failure to match its improved discourse on religious freedom to the actual institutional practice of it. I point to the example of Rada Abel Rahman, a Qur'anist and teacher, after years of harassment by Egyptian authorities, has now been in prison since last August, simply for believing in teachings that vary from the officially accepted version of Islam. I also look to the case of Anas Hassan, who an Alexandria court sentenced to 3 years in prison since 2020 for managing a Facebook page that promoted atheism. Such cases broadly fall under Egypt's dismal record of blasphemy, related prosecutions, which, as a recent USCIRF report documented, negatively impacts Christians, minority Muslims, and non-believers alike. Recognized by many as the world's oldest country, Egypt is a great country and can do better than this. While we at USCIRF have been encouraged by Egypt's shift in public discourse and modest reforms regarding religious freedom in recent years, as we have consistently expressed, we continue to recognize that it remains a long way from matching that discourse with the reality on the ground. And until those hopes become a reality, we will continue to advocate for the full rights and freedoms of the Coptic community based on the inescapable truth that religious freedom in Egypt can only truly come through religious freedom for all Egyptians from Alexandria to Aswan. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone. If you just joined us, we were listening to pre-recorded messages from some US legislators as well as government officials. And as USCIRF Commissioner James Carr mentioned, it's important that we speak about religious freedom for all minorities in Egypt, not just for Copts. And also Congressman Beyer, who is the co-chair of the Egypt Human Rights Caucus, mentioned Hisham Heikel. And Councillor Heikel was actually fired from his position for standing up for a Coptic colleague who experienced discrimination. And it didn't just stop at being fired, but he's been pursued to the point of not being able to have a passport, not being able to have his national ID card renewed, not being allowed to travel outside of the country, not being able to work anymore. So it's been a very extreme situation. And as an organization that advocates on behalf of Copts, we believe that it's important also to mention those who are suffering merely for standing up against discrimination. So Councillor Heikel actually sent us a very short statement that he asked us to read. I'm going to read that to you now before we jump into our next panel discussion. So this is from Councillor Hisham Heikel. He says, I held a position of public prosecutor at the Administrative Prosecution Authority and was dismissed after being accused of defending the right of a qualified Christian female counselor to assume the post of president of the Administrative Prosecution Authority. I posted several pertinent videos on YouTube shedding light on the matter, including a lecture entitled Judges Between Dismissal and Immunity, which is posted on Il Insan channel. I also addressed the issue in a program entitled Legitimate Rights on Al Tariq channel. Given the fact I took legal action 3 years ago to appeal the decision to terminate my employment and that the courts have yet to issue a verdict, I would like to authorize Coptic Solidarity to take the appropriate legal measures according to the provisions of international law and in line with the international conventions ratified by the Egyptian government. I sincerely appreciate your help with this matter. Best regards, Hisham Heikel. So with that, and all of the NGOs and guests who we've had participating with us, I think that we can agree that that is certainly an individual that we would like to continue to advocate for together. And we look forward to your recommendations and your partnership in that. So moving along in our program, we have another live panel discussion. Like I did with the last panel, I'm going to introduce all of the panelists first, so I don't have to get in between the presentations. If you have any questions for the panelists, you can type those into the question application here on Zoom, and I'll be reviewing those and hopefully be able to include all of your questions if there's time. So our next panel is titled Exposing Egypt's Double Standard on Religious Freedom. We have 3 excellent panelists who are going to talk about this today. I'm just going to introduce them in order, and then you guys can proceed to make your presentations in that order. First off, we have Mr. Rami Yaqub, who's Executive Director at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Rami is the founder and Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. He's also the founder of the Maktabi audiobooks and podcast platform, in addition to being the former chairman of iProductions and former CEO of Omnia Media, 2 companies under the umbrella of Omedia Holding. Mr. Yaqub holds an MA in International Affairs with a focus on U.S. Middle East relations from American University School of International Service, and a BS in aerospace engineering from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He previously served as Chief of Staff of then Parliament Majority Free Egyptians Party in Egypt. Our second panelist is Dr. Sarah Yerkes, who is Senior Fellow Middle East Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focus is on Tunisia's political, economic, and security developments, as well as state-society relations in the Middle East and North Africa. She's been a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Council on Foreign Relations, International Affairs Fellow, and has taught in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University and at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. She's a former member of the State Department's planning staff, where she focused on North Africa. Previously, she was a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs. She also served as a geopolitical research analyst for the U.S. military's Joint Staff Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate at the Pentagon, advising the Joint Staff leadership on foreign policy and national security issues. And then our third panelist is Mr. Philippe Nassif, who is the Advocacy Director for Middle East, North Africa, and the Americas at Amnesty International. Before coming to Amnesty International, Philippe worked as the Executive Director at In Defense of Christians in the Middle East, where he advocated on behalf of persecuted religious minorities. Before that, he worked at the poverty fighting organization CARE USA, the Obama presidential campaign, and also the White House as part of President Barack Obama's advance team, and for the mayor of Houston, Texas. So with that, you can see we have three excellent panelists. We're very much looking forward to what you all have to share with us today on Egypt. Thank you for your time, and we'll start with Mr. Yaqub.
Lindsay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Coptic Solidarity and my fellow colleagues on this amazing panel, Philippe and Sarah, and obviously hard act to follow after the first panel. But I'll do my best here. I have prepared some quick remarks. I don't think I'm going to be taking the 15 minutes, but let's just give it a shot here. Contempt of religion and repression of minorities and the monopoly by the state on interpretation of religion are all thematic issues plaguing the Middle East and North Africa. And Egypt, being the host of the region's largest minority, is no different than the rest of the region. The plight of Copts in Egypt and the many other religious minorities is a struggle that has been ongoing not only for tens of years, but hundreds, with varying intensities, degrees, and forms, of course. I will say, we are seeing some improvements with regards to the general conditions of Copts and the houses of worships pertaining to Copts. In fact, I recall my advocacy meetings alongside Carolyn Doss and others in 2013 regarding the conditions of Copts. Back then, churches were being burned in rows, Copts were being pushed out of their homes by the masses, properties confiscated, etc. So yes, the government has delivered on a lot of the things that they promised with regards to building churches, or at least the ones that they wanted to restore. With that said, I must say that the narrative presented by the Egyptian embassy and its affiliates is a clear exaggeration of improvements and grotesque misrepresentation of the reality on the ground. Echoing Commissioner Carr's remarks, it is also important to note that other religious minorities, including atheists, are also struggling and are unrecognized. It would be remiss if I did not highlight their plight as well. Now, allow me to share some of the underlying and thematic issues that continue to plague and linger, affecting Copts specifically and other religious minorities in general. So we have some issues that I'd like to talk about now. One of them is the denigration of religious trials, religion's trials. Egyptian authorities have expanded the use of denigration of religions, the law itself, trials, to prosecute religious minorities, including Muslims who follow the majority Sunni sect, but hold different interpretations of the faith, contrary to the official's religious state institutions. In 2020, Egyptian courts sentenced 7 defendants in 5 separate cases, 2 of whom belonged to Shiite sects, in addition to the public prosecution investigating 14 cases in which decisions were issued for imprisonment pending investigation. The list of defendants included Christians, Shiite, and Quranists. These trials are based on unclear legal articles and are used selectively in favor of Sunni Islam, unfortunately, and violate several rights of the accused, including freedom of religion or belief, freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to a fair trial. These trials reflect the ruling regime's control over religious affairs, the control of conservative vision of official religious institutions, and the punishment of those of whom contradict them. That's the first issue. Second major issue that continues to linger is customary councils. I believe a lot of our audience knows what customary councils are, but we can definitely address it later at length. Egyptian authorities utilize customary councils as an illegitimate alternative to implementing the law to help those involved in sectarian attacks evade criminal accountability. Additionally, pressure applied by official institutions on the victims to accept the customary council's reconciliation, including the waiver of their rights and recognition of that before that the responsible judicial authorities. Instead of completing the legal procedures to try the aggressors, the judicial authorities accept this reconciliation and forego the completion of investigations and trial procedures. Furthermore, neither the government nor the aggressors compensate the victims for their financial and material losses they suffer in almost all cases. Third issue, the church construction law. Echoing Ambassador Fernandez's remarks from the previous panel, the issue of churches without worshipers and worshipers without churches is a major problem in Egypt. The church construction law added a slight improvement in granting allocating land to churches in new cities and affluent neighborhoods in major cities, such as he referred to, the new Coptic Orthodox Cathedral in the new capital, where there are few, if at all, residents, and well-to-do Christians do not suffer from the problems in building churches and practicing religious rites. On the other hand, in hundreds of villages and slums, unfortunately, nationwide, the majority of Christians still cannot organize religious services if they don't have these buildings and religious institutions built in their neighborhoods and towns. And authorities have not granted licenses for churches or religious buildings to practice religious rites. The Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, also known as EIPR, has documented at least 36 cases of sectarian tension and violence since the beginning of the implementation of the church construction law. That date was September 28, 2016. All related to the practice of religious rites, and the interventions of various state institutions in the same period led to the closure of 25 churches and the prevention of the holding collective religious rites in areas within them. Furthermore, another topic that is continuing to linger, targeting of activists and human rights defenders. The security apparatuses have targeted activists and human rights defenders who document sectarian attacks and aspects of religious discrimination. For example, Rami Kamel, as many have spoken about him today, who was arrested well over a year ago and charged with joining a terrorism organization, a misuse of the terrorism law that we can discuss further later, without specifying the group or noting any relation to particular terrorism activity. He has been held in inhumane and difficult conditions since then. Additionally, local human rights organizations such EIPR and others who document sectarian abuses have been targeted, particularly going after the leadership and staff. Similarly, a number of victims in cases of sectarian tension and contempt for religions received threats not to speak with civil society organizations or the media, effectively placing an unofficial gag order on reporting these attacks, all in an attempt to convey the impression that conditions have improved in the field of religious freedoms. Executions and other violations. According to Amnesty International, Egypt's authorities have executed at least 51 men and women in the first half of 2021. In October 2020, Human Rights Watch documented the execution of 49 men and women in Egyptian authorities in 10 days, forgive me. These executions included executions of Christians, such as Wa'il Saad Tawadrus Mikhail, aka Monk Isaiah. UN experts expressed their grave concerns about the allegation of torture and ill treatment of Father Isaiah and his co-defendants. Father Isaiah was reportedly detained, incommunicado, subjected to ill treatment, forced to confess under torture. The credible allegation of the torture of Monk Isaiah were never investigated before his execution. Now, I realize the executions is a larger issue that faces a lot of Egyptians, not just Copts, but I'm just wanting to express that also Copts are subjected to these matters. As one last thing with regards to women's rights, and this is just a general note, as Stephen mentioned in the previous panel, women's rights in Egypt are also at dismal levels. Let's just note that young women are being charged with human trafficking charges, sentenced to 6 to 10 years in prison, plus financial penalties for creating dance videos on TikTok. Women who have spoken out about gang rape cases were intimidated and cases were dismissed. This happens to well-to-do women from affluent neighborhoods and classes. I'm sure you can imagine how women in less affluent classes are treated. And in the case of Coptic women, the added burden of being a minority. And I'll leave it at that. These are all issues that face Copts, but don't face Copts alone. These are thematic issues facing religious minorities and Egyptians at large. And I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Coptic Solidarity. It's really an honor to be with all of you and to be on this esteemed panel. So I'm going to speak about the major disconnect between the de jure protections for religious freedom and the de facto situation on the ground, and then spend a few minutes at the end talking about how to combat this really dangerous double standard. So the overall theme, I think, of my remarks is really about the disconnect between rhetoric and reality. And what I mean is that while on paper there is religious equality in Egypt, in practice, significant discrimination and marginalization exists. And I want to highlight, that this is not just a problem in the realm of religious freedom. As we've heard throughout today, Egypt is undergoing massive crackdowns on human rights of all forms, including arbitrary arrest, detention, and harassment of human rights defenders and opposition figures, cases of forced disappearance, torture of activists and journalists. And we could spend the entire day just talking about these abuses and, frankly, the lack of adequate international pressure or response to stop these abuses. But today we're talking about religious freedom and persecution of minorities, specifically the Coptic community. And I just want to highlight the point that others have made also, which is that, this situation that we will describe that we're talking about is particularly terrible for the Coptic community, but it's even worse for members of other religions, such as the few remaining Jews in Egypt, or Baha'is, or atheists, people who do not subscribe to any religion, who suffer everything that we're going to talk about and more. So first of all, what do the legal protections look like on paper? The Egyptian constitution states that, quote, freedom of belief is absolute, and the freedom of practicing religious rituals and establishing worship places for the followers of divine religions is a right regulated by law. The constitution also states that citizens are, quote, equal before the law. It criminalizes discrimination and incitement to hatred based upon religion, belief, sex, origin, race, or, quote, any other reason. And the penal code then criminalizes discrimination based on religion and defines it as including any, quote, action or lack of action that leads to discrimination between people or against a sect due to religion or belief. So given all of that, if you just read the Constitution, the picture that paints is really, a very progressive constitution, a state that really practices freedom of religion, that protects people of all faiths or no faith at all. But that's not the reality, as we well know. And the Constitution, also states that, quote, Islam is the religion of the state, and the principles of Islamic Sharia are the main sources of legislation. And so when you add that phrasing on top of all the other things that I laid out before, what you end up with is that it pretty much negates all of the other aspects of freedom of religion. The idea that Islam is the religion of the state, despite there being freedom of religion, relegates all non-Muslims to secondary status. Now, family law does exist in each of the major religions, and here we're just talking about Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. If you're outside of those three, you're sort of a separate class altogether. But if you are a Christian or a Jew, you can use the family law system that applies to religion, but it's separate. And there are separate laws as well, as we've talked about, for building churches as well as for building mosques. And as we know, separate is not equal. Furthermore, consistent with Sharia, the law stipulates that Muslim women are not permitted to marry non-Muslim men. There are mixed marriages, of course. If you are a Muslim man, you're welcome to marry a non-Muslim woman. But if you happen to be in a mixed marriage, the courts will follow the Sharia law of the Muslim spouse, not the family law of the non-Muslim spouse, meaning that the non-Muslim spouse is at a disadvantage. They don't get to actually use the family law that applies to their own faith. We've talked quite a bit already about the law, the 2016 law, that giving the power to the local government to actually authorize church construction. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think this is really important when we're talking about the difference between rhetoric and reality. So this law was put in place in 2016 as a way to fix the really broken system of agreeing to have church permits, agreeing to church construction. Previously, the central government had been in charge of the church construction permit approval. But the law in 2016 delegated that power to the governorates, the governors of the governorates. And again, on paper, this is a great idea. First of all, you get outside of the really kind of notoriously slow Egyptian bureaucracy. You're going to take that out of the central state, localize that. But more importantly, governors are much more familiar with the local context. They, more than the central state, will know what's going on in their government. They should know where the church needs really are and should be able, on paper, to be able to be much more responsive. And the law also put in a provision, which was really important, that the governor is expected to respond within 4 months to the receipt of an application for legalization of a church. And any refusal to approve that application must include a written justification. Again, great on paper. However, the law doesn't actually have any sort of provision for appeal, nor does it specify recourse if a governor fails to respond within the required time frame. So what this means in practice is that the governor doesn't respond in 4 months, they decide to just let this thing roll, take all their time they want. There's no way to appeal that, and there's no way to push that decision to be made within a reasonable time frame. Additionally, what we found is that, in fact, since this law was put in place, only about a third of the pending applications have been approved and have had any sort of movement on them. So 2/3 of existing applications still haven't had any sort of action on them. And then furthermore, if you have a governor who decides they just don't want to build the church, or they don't like this application that's been submitted, there's no way to appeal that decision. You may get a written response back saying that it's denied, but then you're stuck. You can't really do anything about that. So what we see here, is this massive difference between what the law looks like on paper and what it looks like on practice. Now, going to the point of rhetoric, one of the things I think is really important to understand is the official message of the Sisi regime is the relationship between the Copts and the state is the best it has ever been. Sisi, throughout his time in power, has really used this idea of one Egypt, pluralism, of respect for all Egyptians. This has been part of his mantra. This is how he justifies, in a way, his role on the world stage. He's not out there saying that Egypt is this massive authoritarian regime that discriminates against people and jails activists and murders activists. He paints a picture to the public that he's actually, someone who values freedom, who values democracy. But as we know, in reality, that's not the case. And so while Sisi, on the one hand, is preaching this pluralism, is preaching tolerance, what we actually find is persistent discrimination, as well as high levels of religiously motivated violence and terrorism. And just a few of the cases, we've already heard, I think, quite a bit about the case of activist Army Camo, who was arrested in November of 2019. And just, to highlight his case, he was arrested because he was a very effective activist and a very effective voice for the Coptic community. He was someone who was arrested right as he was about to go to Geneva to participate in the UN Forum on Minority Issues, where he was going to talk about some of the marginalization, the discrimination that we've been talking about. And so you can see that it's not just a case of sort of sectarian violence of one group against the other. There's actually a really concerted effort by the state to silence these voices. And I think another case that's really important to highlight is that an Egyptian criminal court acquitted 3 Muslim men who were accused of stripping naked an elderly Coptic Christian woman and parading her through the streets of a village in southern Egypt in 2016. The mob attacked the then 70-year-old woman because her son was rumored to be having an affair with a Muslim woman. This is just one of the most horrific and brutal cases. I think it's so clear how terrible this was and how clearly in violation this was of Egyptian law. And initially, the 3 men who carried this out were sentenced to 10 years in prison in absentia, but then they stood a retrial, and that resulted in their acquittal recently. And so again, you can see that the system of justice is just not working. We've also seen a rise in terrorism targeting Christians, and the Islamic State's Sinai province has killed more than 100 Copts in Egypt, with complaints that the state has failed to protect Christians from the terror attacks targeting them. Now, in addition to this kind of divide between rhetoric and reality, what we see is the legal measures don't actually address the bigger issue of persistent discrimination. Religious minorities face discrimination in every sector of society. They are underrepresented in important fields, including the judiciary, local and national government, high-ranking military offices, police and law enforcement, and diplomatic positions. They're excluded from the intelligence service and the presidential staff on security grounds. Non-Muslims are rarely appointed as mayors, even in villages where Christians make up the majority of the population. We see discrimination in universities, exclusion of Coptic history from school curricula, and Copts face discrimination when enrolling in certain schools and institutions. And although there were quotas put in place in the last parliamentary elections, only 6% of the legislature is Christian, which is a much smaller percentage than is actually represented in Egyptian society. So as a result of the marginalization, you have a lot of really concrete things, which is one is this failure to make progress on the church construction law, which, as we've talked about, leaves Copts without a place of worship in many, many areas. You also have a lot of violence against Copts that occurs around this church construction and debates and disagreements over church construction. And you continue to see sectarian violence on all levels. But this discrimination and marginalization also breeds frustration and discontent. There's little justice or recourse for victims of sectarian violence and for their families. As we just heard from Rami, this idea of reconciliation sessions that are put in place instead of the formal court system usually results in a lack of justice. The victims are usually pressured into participating in these, and there's a culture of impunity against perpetrators of sectarian violence. So what can be done to address this? I think, first of all, the Egyptian government needs to enforce all the provisions of the church construction law, including allowing for review of permits and adding a provision for appeals so that people are actually able to make this law work for them. And they also need to focus their efforts on building churches in areas where there are none, not just focusing, again, as we've heard, on the more elite areas, but really getting churches out into the villages where people do not have a place to worship. But they also, I think, more importantly, need to work on rooting out the culture of discrimination through education, starting at the earliest levels, focusing the curriculum on multiculturalism and pluralism. If this is what CC is preaching, if he believes that Egypt is home of multiculturalism, if it's a pluralist society that preaches tolerance, teach that. Teach about all religions. Teach about the importance of unity and tolerance, starting in the elementary school. Additionally, Egypt should do away with the reconciliation sessions and prosecute all cases of religious violence within the regular court system, and then create and enforce religious quotas in key public sector arenas and security services to ensure that these services, who hold so much power, actually represent the Egyptian population. But doing this would require an honest census to determine the actual population of Copts within Egypt, which is something that's not likely to happen. The Egyptian government is very much afraid of actually finding out how many Coptic Christians there are within Egyptian society. And let me just end quickly with what I think we can maybe expect from the Biden administration regarding Egypt. I know that the previous session talked about US policy, but I think it's really important to highlight that, while there were a lot of high hopes for more engagement on human rights issues under Biden, frankly, those of us who watch these issues have been really disappointed in the lack of the administration's attention to these issues, the human rights issues in Egypt. And I want to draw attention and end with this idea of leverage. The United States often forgets or underestimates the amount of leverage it has over Egypt and the ability it has to pressure Egypt and to pressure CC to stop some of the egregious human rights violations, including those against the Coptic community. So why does Egypt need the United States? I think that's pretty clear. We give them $1.3 billion in foreign military financing every year. They're the second highest recipient of foreign aid next to Israel. This is a substantial amount of money. Egypt relies on this money for all sorts of things, as well as for credibility. This is the second thing that Egypt needs from us. As I mentioned before, Sisi is trying to paint himself as something that he's not. He's trying to paper over his abuses. He needs the United States to stand there and support them, to stand next to them, and to not call him out on human rights abuses on a public stage in order to maintain that credibility and the level of impunity that he's become accustomed to. But why does the United States need Egypt? And here I think the traditional reasons that we've given really are kind of sandcastles that quickly fall down once you examine them. And the first is that the United States thinks of Egypt, has traditionally thought of Egypt as a major player in the region. And I think that regional role really has started to wane over the past several years. We saw during the recent Gaza conflict that Egypt has been able to leverage itself to be at times a helpful partner in the Israeli-Palestinian space, but it's certainly not the only actor that can play this role or has played this role. The second reason the United States gives for needing Egypt is that time and again, we've used the excuse of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty to justify these exorbitant amounts of foreign aid to Egypt and our failure to speak out about Egyptian human rights abuses. But again, what we've seen over the past several years is Egypt is not the only game in town anymore. There are several countries that have normalized relations with Israel. If we're counting on Egypt to be this beacon of stability, I don't think that that's actually accurate anymore. And then finally, Suez Canal access. And this is the third misguided fear that if we upset Egypt, they're going to cut off our Suez Canal access. And I think, again, if we look at this recent incident of the Ever Given, the ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal, it's much more in Egypt's interest to keep that canal flowing for every single minute of every single day than it is to cut off access to the major global superpower of the United States. So the bottom line where I want to end here is that Egypt needs us way more than we need them. And there's a lot of room in this administration to pressure Egypt and to act as a force for good, to address sectarian violence and discrimination, along with all the other myriad human rights issues. And I'll end there.
You can go ahead and start, Philippe.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Sarah and Rami, and everybody else who is tuning in this afternoon. My name is Philippe Nassif, and as mentioned earlier, I'm the Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about Egypt, and it's quite timely because I was speaking earlier today at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom on this very topic, in addition to a slew of other Middle Eastern and North African countries on the issues of international religious freedom and religious minorities. And Egypt was front and center in my remarks, simply because it was warranted to be front and center in my remarks due to the numerous violations that you've heard of so far from the other panelists and even earlier today. I'm going to take a different approach here. I'm not going to speak too long because I want to make sure that we get time for some questions to be asked our moderator and from other folks if that's what we're going to be doing. As somebody who's tasked with advocating to the United States government on the Middle East and North Africa, broadly speaking, Sarah just ended on a note that I want to just sort of pick up from, which is the issue of leverage. And indeed, she's 100% correct, and that the United States seems to underestimate, whether accidentally or deliberately, the leverage that it has over the Egyptian government and Egypt. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then go on to some of the more specific violations that we have been documenting as an organization in Egypt, broadly speaking, for the whole population, but also for Coptic Christians. But on the issue of leverage, I do think that as a country that is indeed receiving plenty of military assistance and arms sales from the United States, that there has to be standards, human rights standards, they need to be met by that recipient country. So, in terms of our policy as an organization and advocating for arms sales bans to countries that are systemic violators of human rights, whether it's Coptic Christians or whether it's Muslim Brotherhood members, whether it's other political dissidents in the countries, doesn't matter. They're all human rights violations. Amnesty International has labeled Egypt one of the world's largest open-air prison for critics because of the thousands and thousands of people that have been rounded up and detained over the past several years under the leadership of President Sisi. That is not a new practice in Egypt. However, it has gotten tremendously worse under the leadership of the current president. And Coptic Christians are indeed swept up in this broader crackdown on dissent, 100%. And as I mentioned earlier today at the USCIRF event, regardless of whether you're Christian or Muslim, any other religious minority, or any class, any racial background, if you're in Egypt, even if other nationalities, if you have spoken out against the current leadership of Egypt, you can find yourself in best case scenarios imprisoned, in worst case killed. And that's sort of the foundation for which the conversation today needs to be had. It is a foundation that is built on oppression and deep systematic abuses of human rights across the board for the Egyptian people. So Egypt fits a perfect mold of a violator of human rights. It should not be receiving the kind of assistance that it receives from the United States. It should not be receiving military assistance. It should not be receiving delegations of members of Congress, of other government officials, unless those government officials from the United States are bringing up human rights abuses and specific cases of people who are detained, or large populations of people who are detained in Egypt without due process, without any sort of fair trial, without any reason for them to be held. There needs to be a total recalibration when it comes to the United States relationship with Egypt. And I think that President Biden knows that he needs to lead that effort. I think it's not been at the top of the list of human rights, or of rather foreign policy priorities in the region. I think human rights is on that list. I don't think it really was on the previous administration's list at all. And I don't need to sort of go into that because I think history has shown that that's very much the case. However, I do think that President Biden wants to tackle these issues, but just hasn't really has not really prioritized the issue of human rights, specifically on Egypt, more so than other countries. President Biden immediately came out and said that he will no longer authorize the United States to support the Saudi UAE-led coalition engaged in hostilities in Yemen. He did not come out in the first several weeks and announce the recalibration of the relationship with Egypt. And so that kind of gives you a sense of Egypt being a tougher issue to tackle for the administration and for the advocacy community, and all of you who are listening in today who want to see some sort of positive change in the relationship between the United States and Egypt. I think that the core problem is one that actually plagues a lot of the views of the United States government when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, which tends to be one viewed through a security lens, one where if the United States punishes Egypt a little bit too hard, they will walk away from the peace deal with Israel. If the United States pushes them too hard, they'll go running toward Russia or running toward China. The actual facts are quite different. Egypt has a lot to lose if it does any of those things. And the government of Egypt knows that. What the government of Egypt also knows is that the focus almost exclusively over the past 6 to 8 years, I'd say, on private engagement with the Egyptian government between the United States and Egypt on human rights issues actually works in their favor. We've seen no real change in the behavior from the Egyptian government on a lot of the issues that you've heard about today discussed regarding human rights abuses, particularly on Coptic Christians, with the private engagement that's supposedly happening between US government officials and the Egyptian government. Instead, you see these sort of grandiose gestures being made by President Sisi, such as the building of the largest Coptic cathedral in the whole region, and other sort of measures, some of which are positive in terms of the building of churches and the loosening of some of the restrictions on moving that ball forward, so to speak. But at the end of the day, we need people, right? We need Coptic Christians to be able to show up to this cathedral and fill its pews fully, and not fear for their lives, whether it's from non-state actors or the state itself, and being able to worship freely and speak their minds freely, as all Egyptians have been trying to do. And so, at the end of the day, it gets back to the initial conversations of leverage and what the United States is articulating to the Egyptian government on a whole host of human rights issues. You've heard about the case of Rami Kamo. You've heard about a few other non-Egyptian citizens or dual citizens who have died in Egyptian prisons. These cases are all being elevated in the United States Congress. You've seen a shift in the US Congress, not big, but still a shift away from just 100% consumption of the talking points from the Egyptian government and Egyptian lobbying efforts in Washington, and more of distance and sort of analysis as to what this relationship is actually getting the United States in the region, and actually what it's doing for Egypt's stability in the long term. So these are the kind of questions that are being asked and should be asked. Our recommendations to the United States government is that the next time there's a delegation or high-level officials visiting Egypt, or as their case was this week, when you have an Egyptian delegation visiting Washington, meeting with the United States government, there needs to be a couple of things that are immediately on the table going forward. I think the first one is that the US delegation should be bringing up some of these specific cases you've heard about today. The cases of people who are currently sitting in prison in Egypt or who have gone missing in Egypt, and some of the, open cases of victims killed in the Rabat Square massacre and other sort of atrocities that have occurred in Egypt over the past decade or so. This is the kind of pressure the Egyptians need to see in private and also publicly. They need to be held accountable for the violations that have occurred, and they need to be shown the United States is serious about actually upholding them to the same standards that we uphold other nations and ourselves. I think the next thing the United States government should be doing is, when visiting Egypt, insist on meeting with some of the dissidents. Make sure that the interviews that you're giving to any media entities include some of the local entities that exist on the ground in Egypt who are actually doing some of the reporting and doing some of the hard work, the human rights defenders doing some of the hard work in Egypt proper. I often have made that recommendation or have heard that recommendation made, and the United States government will say, well, we don't want to put them in harm's way. They're already in harm's way. Every time I've talked to them, they're already fearful for what tomorrow brings. So don't make that decision for them. Let them make that decision on their own and empower them, because when you lift their voices up, it's far more difficult for the Egyptians to shut them down or disappear them entirely or drive them out of the country, as we've seen happen numerous times with other organizations. And again, this could be Coptic human rights defenders, this could be political dissidents, journalists, whomever. Lift those voices up. And the third thing is, as I mentioned earlier, be more public. I think the United States needs to be more public. I think President Biden needs to be more public with the egregious human rights violations that have occurred in Egypt, past, present, and likely future, and actually call them out. Say that if Egypt is a true security partner of the United States and a true partner of peace in the region, then they need to certainly uphold those standards within their own borders first and foremost, before they continue to receive the level of attention and almost the outsized compliments that they get from the United States government for their regional role, however minor or major it may be in the region's conflicts. So that's sort of our position on the issue. I think I'll just close by saying that as an organization that focuses exclusively on human rights, we don't call for sanctions, we don't call for some of the other things that other organizations may call for. I want everybody to understand that international religious freedom and the issue of religious minorities is protected in the international human rights framework. So, if we are maybe having an event focusing on one particular religious group, that's okay. Because as long as we talk about it more holistically as a broader problem, because at the end of the day, if you are a Christian that is being persecuted in Egypt, you could also be a Christian female who is being persecuted, or a Christian LGBTQ female. And at the end of the day, all of these rights are under assault in a country like Egypt and in numerous countries across the region. So we holistically approach the abuses as an organization. We document these abuses, and then we publicly release our findings in the many reports that many of you have likely seen over the years, and will continue to do so until we'll hopefully see a change in behavior from the Egyptian government, and certainly a change in tenor from the United States government. So thank you. Lindsay, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. You all shared some really fantastic information, very interesting, a lot of good recommendations. So thank you for making the time to join us today. I think we'll go with the same format as with our last panel, and I'm just going to direct questions to individuals to kind of diminish any kind of confusion. So Rami, we're going to give you a hard one here to start with. Coptic church officials from the three main denominations, Orthodox, Evangelical, and Catholic, have not spoken out on behalf of imprisoned Coptic activists such as Rami Kamal, Patrick Zaki, and Peter Ragib. How do you view the role of the Coptic churches in alleviating or worsening the situation for Copts in Egypt?
That is a hard one, but I'll do my best. I will speak, I think, on behalf of myself and the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, TIMEP, in saying we are adamant and very strong believers in the separation of church and state, or mosque and state, or what have you. I don't expect, even though the Egyptian Coptic Church, particularly the Coptic Orthodox Church, particularly acts as both kind of a religious authority and a theological authority, I don't really expect them to stand for anyone. That's just my humble view. Obviously, it would have been very good if they could, but I will also say I understand the pressures that are mounted on religious minority leaders in Egypt. There's a lot of pressure on these individuals. I'm not defending them. I have a lot of issues with what they do and some of the decisions that they made, and a lot of the statements that they made as well. I think some of it's destructive, but I will say we have to look at their actions sometimes in that it's not in a vacuum. It is in this environment that all of us were just explaining how repressive it is, how antagonistic it is to any opposing opinion. So I'm definitely, I understand sometimes that they don't stand up for these individuals. Furthermore, I believe that, unfortunately, the dark side of it is that sometimes the church wants to maintain the monopoly of controlling the opinion or the narrative, or speaking on behalf of its subjects, if you will, and not believers, but they viewed as subjects. And there's definitely a part of it that is that as well. I doubt that, just to say that clearly, I doubt that their position will change. I doubt that they will stand up for these individuals. This is not something new. I mean, this has been ongoing since what happened at Maspero in 2011. Also, in very rare cases, perhaps the woman that Sarah was referring to in Armenia that was stripped naked and paraded around town. There's been some statements by the Coptic Orthodox Church where they're like supportive of it, but current leadership of the Coptic Orthodox Church is weighing it probably politically. It's better for them to stay out of it. So I doubt that this will change. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. I think that there's a lot of different angles that one needs to consider. And, we often hear kind of statements from different sides with a very black and white opinion. And I think that you provided a really nuanced perspective on some of the issues that the church has to consider. So thank you for that. The second question is for Sarah. You spoke also about how it's not just, Copts who suffer discrimination, but other religious minorities, and that some of them aren't, one of the three heavenly religions, such as Baha'i or atheists. They also are going to suffer even more than a Coptic Christian would. And so my question for you is, do you support affirmative action for Copts and other religious minorities in Egypt? If you do or don't, please explain.
Sure. Yeah, I think, affirmative action is tricky. It's one of these things that I'll split this up because you can talk about affirmative action in education and in the political system in different areas. And if you look at sort of the research on quotas, for example, on parliamentary quotas, can you have different groups you're required to have a certain number of people in parliament? And what the scholarly research finds is that they're really crucial to getting people in, especially in places where minority populations, or whether it's women or different religious groups, are discriminated against. The society hasn't been normalized to this idea of whatever type of population being in power. So if you have a gender quota, if you have a religious quota, there's quotas for people with disabilities in certain areas, it helps get them the first step, which is getting them into a position of power. Then that becomes normal. You start to see that the political system is made up of all of these different types of people. But the question is, are they actually empowered? And unfortunately, a lot of the literature finds that they're not, that, they're in there, which is great. It's better than not being in there, but it doesn't necessarily give them the sort of keys to the kingdom, the power to actually make changes that will implement or sort of improve their status. And I think that in general, I'm sort of hedging and not answering your question, but I think in general, I support the idea of affirmative action to get people in to different systems, but then that's not enough. You need to do a lot more to figure out what are the other steps, what are the other reasons that people are still not empowered, that they're still not maybe taken as seriously, or they're not able to pass the legislation they need, they're not able to access the jobs and the positions of authority that they need. But yeah, as a first step, as a way to kind of break the first barrier of access, I do support that for COPs and for other groups as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's helpful. And also explaining that, once you get there, there's still a lot of other factors involved and a lot of other steps, that it's not just an easy solution that once we get affirmative action, everything will change. My next question is for Philippe. And I think that coming off your experience with In Defense of Christians and also from a Middle East background, you can help apply some of other situations to the Coptic one. What kinds of things from your experience you think would be most effective for COPs in the diaspora to focus on and improving the situation for COPs in Egypt?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Lindsay. I think that the struggle all of these diaspora communities have is fear for their families back at home, while exercising the privilege that they have to not be in the same situation some of their family members, meaning one, they could be dangerous to speak out against the government or against an armed group or whatever the case may be. And so that balancing act is quite tough. But I think ultimately the Egyptian diaspora and the Coptic diaspora here in the United States and other nations has really yet to actually flex its muscle and engage in the kind of advocacy that is needed for Egypt. I think that at the end of the day, they are the most powerful tool any human rights organization can have here in the United States, as part of their efforts to hold Egypt accountable for human rights abuses. And I think those voices are tremendously important. Those indigenous Egyptian voices are tremendously important in lobbying Congress and meeting with the White House and the Pentagon and other levels of the executive branch and the executive to articulate just why Egypt is such a violator of human rights and why the United States needs to change its tune when it comes to engaging Egypt. I think that for folks that sort of struggle with fear of what would happen if they were to advocate for a robust response from the United States on some of the abuses currently taking place under President Sisi, and that could somehow cause a cascading effect in Egypt that would bring a new government that would be very hostile to their communities. I mean, this is something that I hear people genuinely worry about. And I've heard that from Iraqi Christians. I've heard that from Syrian Christians. I've heard that from numerous communities from Iran to Morocco that are worried about too much pressure and exercising too much of their privilege being in a safe place actually does a disservice to the communities that still exist in these countries. My response to that is that those are very valid concerns. And I think that people need to understand that, people like myself and others who don't have family in Egypt, for example, using Egypt here, that those are very real fears and that these communities have faced centuries of persecution. This is not a new phenomena. This is a very, very old phenomena that has been occurring for a long time. And so they have learned to hide or to not raise their voice because that's often saved them. And so what we need to do as advocates is give them the tools they need to speak up while understanding the historical significance of not speaking up for so long, and empower them to meet with members of Congress. Often can be done in private in lobbying efforts and show that they care about the future of their fellow citizens or family that still are living in Egypt under deteriorating conditions. Because at the end of the day, if they don't speak up now, there'll just be less and less and less of their communities to defend in the future. And that is the sad reality of religious minorities across the board in the Middle East and North Africa. I think that Syria is a perfect example where you had a lot of communities initially very, very fearful of speaking up against the government of Assad. And almost 10 years later, the numbers of those communities were decimated, not just from ISIS or from the civil war, but actually from immigration, from just leaving because there is no country for them to live in anymore. And so, you don't want to have that happen to one of the, or in fact, the largest population of Christians in terms of numbers in the Middle East. And so I think it's important that we empower these communities, articulate why it's important for them to advocate while understanding their shared experience is one of trauma and hardship.
Thank you. It looked like Rami, you looked like you might want to jump in there. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that response?
Well, I mean, I think Philippe covered it very well, and I think him noting that that these fears are legitimate, that that these concerns that people in diaspora have are legitimate. I'm always reluctant to give my own personal view on it, but I think I agree, being a cop myself, but I definitely agree 100% with what Philippe is saying. And I think there is something that I would like to say to, I guess, Copts in diaspora, if you will, which is you don't have to be calling for the dissemination or destruction of a complete regime to be asking for a little bit of better rights or better conditions for your fellow ethnic or religious brothers and sisters wherever you're from. That applies to religious minorities, applies to ethnic minorities, applies to whatever, right? I think this is part of the self-censorship that we apply as Middle Easterners upon ourselves. It's something that it's intrinsically and inherently built in us. Keep quiet lest it be worse. And there is room for negotiation, there's room for growth, and there's room for making things better without calling for like chaos and anarchy. Asking for law to be implemented is not going to bring down the police authorities, or it's not going to lead automatically to the firebombing of police stations. Asking for the cancellation of, or the cancellation of, asking for things to be prosecuted in the judicial system will not lead to Sisi leaving power. Right? So it's just keeping that in mind, that you can ask for these things, you can advocate for them without fearing that you're going to lose everything and it will be hell on earth in Egypt if you do. And that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for adding to that. I think you make an excellent point. We have one more question I'm going to direct at Sarah, and if either of you, Philippe or Rami, want to jump in afterwards, please feel free. This question is from one of our audience. It's, will America specifically and the West generally advocate for human rights when they collide with their interests in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's the the $1.3 billion question, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's it's a nuanced answer, right? I mean, I think it's not that either we advocate for human rights or we don't. I think every single US administration has really struggled with how do you balance that? How do you balance what you perceive to be US national security interests with values such as human rights? And it's not easy to do, but I think, one of the things that's really important is that we recognize that promoting human rights is in the US interest. This is part of our national security interest. Promoting human rights actually brings stability. It brings the kinds of things that, that we say are what we're advocating for. I'm a little bit jaded, but I tend to be an optimist writ large. And I do think there are opportunities, as Philippe was talking about, that we haven't seen it yet. This administration is still quite young too, so I don't think we should close the book on it and say that there's no chance. I think all of us probably know personally a lot of the people who are in there making these decisions now, and I know they're good people. I know that they care about human rights. And so I think that, we've seen incremental steps on some things, not on Egypt yet, but the more we can talk about that, the more that we can point it out and point out ways that they can do it effectively, the more opportunity they'll have to do that. And so I do think it's possible that there are US leaders who certainly do promote human rights, and a lot of it's behind the scenes. Often it's not something that we might hear about or read about in the newspaper. It can happen, and it should happen, and it is part of what will lead to greater stability and greater US peace and security as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to all of you, our panelists. Thank you for your time. Sincerely appreciate the thought that you put into your presentations and to answering the questions from our audience. With that, our event is pretty much over. We just have a closing statement from our president, Ms. Carolyn Doss.
Thank you again to all our honored guests and audience for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the challenging work of exposing Egypt's propaganda toward Coptic Christians. We must remain persistent, attentive, and responsive to those efforts put forth by a government that attempts to minimize the problem at hand while trying to bolster their negligible and overinflated efforts. Remember, our silence gives them the opportunity to change the narrative. Let's not give them that chance by publicizing the facts and advocating for the equality of Christians in Egypt. We must continue to publish reports, such as Jihad of the Womb, that exposes the epidemic of kidnappings and forced conversions of Christian women. We must continue with campaigns that support resolutions that protect the rights of Christians in Egypt and advocate on behalf of prisoners of conscience like Peter Nashid and Rami Kamel. We are also very excited to announce we are getting ready to launch a new feature on our website where people can report acts of violence perpetrated against Christians, thereby creating our own reporting system for the gathering of data about kidnappings, killings, and attacks on Christians all over Egypt. This allows victims to quickly expose their plight and also provide an avenue for reporting those very often overlooked, forgotten, and gagged victims who can't otherwise tell their story. Thank you again, and we all look forward to a better Egypt for Christians.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We sincerely appreciate it. I did want to let you know that we recorded the program today and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel, hopefully pretty soon here. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to make the program or you want to share it with your supporters, friends, and family, we hope you'll do that. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.